furtherance of the drug trafficking that is addressed in count 4. You understand that's the formal charge in count 5?
Yes.
And do you also understand that if I were to accept your plea of guilty to count 5, that you would face a mandatory minimum penalty of 5 years in prison that would have to be served consecutive to count 4? And that means that I would have no discretion but to begin thinking about a sentence at 10 years. In other words, I could not go below a 10-year sentence when you combine those counts 4 and 5 convictions. You understand that?
Yes.
And do you also understand that in addition, there is a maximum penalty of up to life in prison, a $250,000 fine, and a 5-year period of supervised release that attaches to count 5?
Yes.
So again, for practical purposes, it means that at the time of sentencing, I have no discretion to go below 10 years in prison, and I could sentence you up to life in prison. You understand?
Yes. Yes, Your Honor.
If I were to impose, well, I would have to impose unless I gave you a life sentence, and I have no reason to think I would, but if I give you a period of supervised release, which I'm required to do under count 4, do you understand that you'd be obligated to follow certain terms and conditions of supervised release? And if you violated those terms and conditions, that you could be subject to additional time in prison, up to and including being sent back to prison itself?
Yes, Your Honor.
As for the federal sentencing guidelines, I'll just touch on them briefly. They will be first addressed by the probation office, which will look at the number of points the guidelines attribute to the 2 counts that you're pleading guilty to. They'll consider relevant conduct to those crimes, including certainly the amount of drugs involved and how you use guns in facilitating your drug crime. They'll give you credit for the fact that you've accepted responsibility by pleading guilty, assuming there's no reason to deny you credit. They will consider your role in this offense, your prior criminal record, and any other factor that that office deems relevant. At that point, the probation office issues a report that you and your counsel can object to, as can the government counsel, and then it becomes my responsibility to rule on any objections and determine what the applicable guideline range is for purposes of sentencing. Do you understand that'll be the basic process?
Yes, Your Honor.
Well, that will be the process. Do you also understand that I am not bound to sentence you within any determined guideline range and could give you a higher sentence up to life imprisonment or a lower sentence down to 10 years if I believe it better serves the purposes of sentencing?
Yes, Your Honor.
I know that you understand that by pleading guilty today, you're going to be waiving valuable constitutional rights. They're set forth at paragraph 2 of your written plea agreement, and I'm not going to go through them in detail now, but I am going to review the most fundamental rights to make sure that you and I are on the same page as to what you're waiving. The most fundamental right that you waive is your right to a jury trial. To have a general understanding as to what a jury trial would have involved.
Yeah, 12 jurors.
Well, it begins with 12 jurors, you're absolutely right. And those would be selected from a larger group of people who are drawn at random from the presidential voting rolls in the last presidential election in the Western District of Wisconsin. They would be brought into a courtroom, at which time you and your counsel, the government's counsel, and I would participate in selecting the jury of 12. Once we'd selected that jury, then the trial begins, where the government has to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You could challenge any of the government's evidence through cross-examination by your counsel or otherwise under rules of evidence. You could then, if you chose to, although you're not required to, present a defense yourself. You could